The House That Whispers. This story is based on a real-life haunting experienced by a family who moved into a seemingly ordinary house, only to uncover something truly sinister within its walls. The horror they endured remains one of the most disturbing cases of supernatural activity ever recorded. When the Whitmore family moved into their new home in rural Pennsylvania, they thought they had found the perfect place to start fresh. It was an old Victorian house, built in the late 1800s, with intricate woodwork and towering ceilings. The price had been suspiciously low, but they brushed it off, believing they had stumbled upon a lucky deal. It wasn't long before things started feeling wrong. The house had a way of making them feel watched. Shadows flickered where there was no light, and whispers echoed through the halls at night. At first, they assumed it was just an old house settling, but the unease grew stronger by the day. Their youngest daughter, Lily, became especially affected. She often woke up screaming, claiming someone was whispering in her ear. When her parents asked what the voice said, she would only whisper back, "It says it's coming." Then, the knocking started. Every night at exactly 3:12 a.m., a rhythmic, deliberate knocking came from inside the walls. No matter where they were in the house, the sound followed them. It wasn't just knocking, it was communication. Then, one night, Lily went missing. They found Lily in the attic, standing in front of a bricked-up doorway. She was in a trance, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wall. Her mother shook her, screaming her name, but the girl wouldn't respond. Finally, she let out a breathy whisper. "They want me to open it." Terrified, her father carried her downstairs, but she kicked and screamed, shrieking that the whispers needed her. The next day, the Whitmores called a contractor to investigate. He examined the bricked-up section and made a chilling discovery. It wasn't part of the original house. Someone had sealed something inside. Curiosity got the best of them, and against their better judgment, they decided to break through the wall. As the bricks crumbled away, the air turned thick and rancid, like something had been rotting for decades. A dark, narrow passage was revealed, leading into the unknown depths of the house. Then, from the darkness, something moved. The passage led to a small, windowless room filled with old, child-sized chairs arranged in a circle. In the center of the room was a single wooden crib, its wood splintered and blackened with age. Scratched into the walls were words in a language none of them could recognize. As they stepped inside, an icy gust of air rushed past them, and the whispering grew louder. The sound was everywhere, surrounding them, inside their heads. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered, overlapping, hissing in a chorus of agony. Then the crib rocked on its own. A shadow took shape in the corner, stretching unnaturally toward them. Its eyes, hollow, sunken pits, locked onto Lily. Suddenly, Lily let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed. Something had entered her. Lily was never the same after that night. She no longer responded to her parents with warmth. Her voice was cold, her stare vacant. She began whispering to herself in a strange language, scrawling symbols on the walls in her own blood. At night, the house came alive. Doors slammed on their own, furniture moved, and guttural growls echoed from the darkened hallways. Then, one night, Lily attacked her mother. She pinned her to the ground with an unnatural strength, her small hands digging into her mother's throat. Her eyes were rolled back, her mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. She didn't speak in her voice anymore. She spoke in the voices of many. Her father managed to pull her away, but not before she whispered into her mother's ear. "You let it out. Now it's never leaving." That was the final straw. The Whitmores fled the house that night. But as they drove away, they saw something watching them from the attic window, something wearing Lily's face. After abandoning their home, the Whitmores learned the dark truth. The house had belonged to a midwife in the 1800s, a woman who had been accused of stealing newborns and sacrificing them in occult rituals. She had been buried alive in the walls of the house as punishment. The hidden room had been her altar, and the thing inside, it wasn't just her. It was every soul she had taken. Lily never recovered. She was placed in a psychiatric institution, where she remained catatonic for years. When she did speak, it was always the same phrase. "The house whispers. It calls for more." The house was later sold to another unsuspecting family. But to this day, neighbors swear they still hear knocking at 3:12 a.m. And sometimes they see a little girl in the attic window, smiling. The eyes that watch at night. Some places are born cursed. Some things should never be seen. This is the true story of a family that moved into a house with a staring presence. Something that watched, waited, and wanted inside. The Grayson family never planned on moving to the countryside, but after financial struggles, they had no choice. They found an old farmhouse deep in the woods of West Virginia. A crumbling structure with peeling wallpaper and a strange rotting smell that never seemed to fade. The real estate agent was hesitant when showing them the house. "It's been empty for a long time," she said. "People don't stay here." They should have listened. The first night, the Graysons realized something was wrong. There were no curtains on the windows, and the house sat in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. The trees pressed against the house like watching figures, their gnarled branches reaching toward the glass. At midnight, Claire Grayson, the mother, woke up to a strange sensation, something watching her. She turned toward the window and saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, wide and unblinking, gleaming in the moonlight from the forest edge. The moment she gasped, they vanished. But the feeling remained. Something out there knew they were here, and it was waiting. The next day, Claire checked the woods, expecting to find animal tracks. There were none. No sign of deer or coyotes. The ground was undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. Then their son, Eric, began talking to someone they couldn't see. "The tall man wants to come inside," he whispered one night at dinner. Claire's stomach dropped. "What man?" Eric's eyes darkened. "He's waiting in the woods. He has big, round eyes. He watches all the time." That night, Claire locked every door and window. She checked them 3 times. But at 3 a.m., the front door stood wide open. Eric was standing on the porch, his head tilted as if listening to something unheard. "He says we have to let him in." That's when Claire saw it. A tall, skeletal figure stood at the tree line, its eyes glowing silver in the dark. The moment she screamed, it moved closer. She grabbed Eric, slammed the door, and locked it again. But as she backed away, the whispering started. From inside the house. The whispering seeped from the walls, from the floors, from the shadows, stretching in the corners. It was inside now. Footsteps creaked in the attic at night. The hallways grew longer in the dark. The windows revealed faces that weren't their own. Eric's behavior worsened. He stopped talking, stopped blinking. He spent hours staring at the walls, his fingers twitching in strange patterns. One night, Claire woke up to find Eric standing in their bedroom doorway. But his eyes were gone. Too black. Empty sockets stared back at her, hollow and infinite. Then, just as suddenly, his real eyes blinked back into place, and he collapsed. "He says you need to see too," he whispered before passing out. Claire and her husband were done. They packed their bags and ran. But when they reached the front door, every window in the house shattered at once. A voice, deep and layered with many mouths, whispered from the broken glass. "You belong to me now." They fled to a motel, leaving everything behind. But the nightmare didn't end. Claire couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them. The eyes, the figure, the endless black void of its gaze. It had marked her. It had shown her something she was never meant to see. Eric grew worse. He refused to look at anyone, claiming, "If I see them, they'll come back." Then the knocking started. At their motel door. Knock, knock, knock. Claire's husband, David, checked the peephole. Nothing. The knocking grew louder. The walls shook. The lights flickered. Then a voice right behind them whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." Claire turned. Eric was levitating off the bed, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. His eyes were gone again. They took Eric to the hospital. The doctors said he was in a catatonic state. They tried everything, but nothing worked. Until one night, Eric spoke. His voice wasn't his own. It was deeper, colder, layered with something inhuman. "It doesn't matter where you go. It sees you. It knows you. It is you." Then with a sickening crunch, his head snapped to the side at an impossible angle. Claire screamed, but the doctors found nothing wrong. They never saw what she saw. Eric never woke up again. They moved to another country. They changed their names. But the feeling never left. Because when Claire looks in the mirror, she doesn't see herself anymore. She sees them, watching, waiting, and she knows, deep in her soul, that one night she will blink, and when she opens her eyes, they'll finally be inside. The devil's face. There are places in this world where something ancient still lingers. Some things are not ghosts, nor demons, nor even spirits. Some things are older than time itself, waiting to be seen, waiting to be remembered. This is the story of a man who saw something he should never have seen and suffered a fate worse than death. In 1987, Daniel Price moved to a small town in Louisiana to start a new job as a history professor. The town was old, forgotten, drenched in secrets. It was the kind of place where no one locked their doors, not because it was safe, but because locks wouldn't matter. Daniel's house was a rental, a creaky, rotting structure that had been abandoned for years. The landlord gave him the keys with a warning. If you hear knocking at night, don't answer. Daniel laughed it off. But that night, something answered for him. At exactly 3:33 a.m., he woke to a sound. A soft, wet breathing in the dark. His room was pitch black, but he felt it, something standing at the foot of his bed. Then, the lightning flashed, and he saw it. A face, but not a human one. It was long, stretched, skin pulled tight over bone, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a gaping black hole. Then it smiled. Daniel screamed, but the figure was gone. But it had left something behind. A single wooden mask resting on his bed. A mask carved into the exact same monstrous face he had just seen. And on the back, something was written in blood. Now that you've seen me, I will never leave you. Daniel burned the mask the next morning. Or at least, he thought he did. He tossed it into the fire pit in his backyard, watching as the flames swallowed the dry wood. The face twisted in the heat, the eyes bubbling, the mouth curling as if in a silent scream. The smell was unbearable, rotting flesh and burnt hair, though he knew it was just wood. And it was gone, or so he thought. That night, he refused to turn off the lights. He kept the TV on, the sound of static filling his room. But at 3:33 a.m., he woke up anyway. The room was pitch black, and the knocking had started. Slow, deliberate, coming from his closet. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel held his breath, forcing himself not to move. His heart pounded. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched. Then, a creak. The closet door wasn't just knocked on. It was opening. Daniel bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp on his nightstand. The bulb flickered. Just enough light to reveal the door was now slightly ajar. His mouth went dry. Then the air changed. The room grew cold, his breath visible in the dim light. And in the mirror across the room, his reflection didn't move. Daniel blinked. His reflection stared back, unmoving. Then, slowly, it smiled before he did. His stomach twisted. He scrambled out of bed, grabbed a towel, and threw it over the mirror. He wasn't going to look. He wasn't going to. Daniel. A whisper. Not from the mirror. From the closet. And then it stepped out. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He refused to move, refused to look. The thing in the closet stood there, its shadow long and unnatural in the dim glow of his bedside lamp. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light. Maybe a coat, maybe some warped shadows, until it tilted its head. The motion was slow, unnatural, like something struggling to mimic human movement. And then it crawled back into the closet, disappearing into the darkness. The door shut on its own. Daniel sat frozen until the sun rose. The next day, he did everything he could to avoid mirrors. He left the house, spent hours at work, refused to go home until exhaustion forced him back. But the feeling never left. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. In the reflection of car windows, in the darkened glass of store doors, in puddles on the street, and worst of all, in every mirror he passed. His reflection was always wrong. It blinked slower than he did. Its movements were delayed. Its smile was always just a little too wide. That night, Daniel covered every mirror in his house. But at 3:33 a.m., he woke to something new. Not knocking, breathing. Long, wet, ragged breaths. Not from the closet. From under his bed. Daniel didn't want to move. His mind screamed at him to stay perfectly still. If he didn't move, maybe it wouldn't know he was awake. But the breathing continued, hot and damp against his bare feet, which hung just over the edge of the bed. Slowly, he reached for his phone, fingers trembling. He turned on the flashlight. Something moved under the bed. Not a scurry, not a quick motion. A slow, crawling movement, like something with too many limbs shifting beneath the mattress. He turned on the flashlight. Nothing was there, but the breathing didn't stop. It was inside his room now. He bolted from bed, flipping on every light in the house. But when he looked around, something was missing. The towel, the one he had thrown over the mirror. It was on the floor. And in the mirror, his reflection was gone. A void stared back at him. Then, something moved in the glass. A shape crawling forward from the blackness. The mask. Its wooden features shifted, cracking as it grinned. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, it peeled its own face open, revealing a mass of screaming mouths underneath. And the voice inside his head whispered, "Where my face?" Daniel blacked out. When he woke up, he wasn't in his house. He was in a hospital, strapped to a bed. His wrists were covered in dried blood. His face felt wrong, swollen, sore. A doctor hovered over him, pale, nervous, terrified. "Mr. Price, do you know what you did?" Daniel tried to speak, but his throat burned. The doctor swallowed hard. "You carved something into your own skin." The room tilted. "We had to sedate you." You wouldn't stop laughing. Daniel's stomach twisted. He reached for his face, fingers shaking. There were stitches all over his skin, his cheeks, his forehead, his mouth. A mirror sat in the corner. He turned his head, and his own horribly carved face stared back at him. A wooden mask of flesh sewn into his skin. He opened his mouth to scream. But another voice, deeper, ancient, inhuman, spoke instead. "He wears my face now." The doctor backed away in horror. Then the lights flickered, and in the reflection of the mirror, something else moved behind him. Something taller, something waiting, something smiling. Daniel never spoke again. Days later, he vanished from his room. The security footage showed him standing in front of the mirror. Then his body twisted, snapped, collapsed inward, and something else stepped out of his skin. The last frame of the footage showed a dark figure grinning at the camera, its gaping mouth filled with countless screaming faces. Then static. No one ever saw Daniel again. But sometimes in abandoned houses, in cracked mirrors, in dark reflections, people still see his face. And if you ever wake up at 3:33 a.m. and hear knocking from inside your closet, don't look, because it's already seen you.